It's funny how sometimes as a kid you don't even need a monster to be scared. Just the promise or the idea of one is more than enough. Just start the rumor, plant the seed, and let the kids' little folktales do the rest. Soon enough, you'll have them scaring the bejesus out of each other over literally nothing. Or at least something close to nothing. Problem is, I have a theory on this kind of thing. I reckon that sometimes, if you get enough kids believing, if enough of them are completely convinced that something is real, then the universe just kinda sits up and pays attention. It's kinda like those hippie types who say they can manifest stuff. You know the ones I mean. You see them all the time on YouTube, either sitting cross-legged with dreadlocks and a dream catcher, talking about how you should ask the universe for the things you want. Or a guy in a suit standing next to a Porsche apparently showing you all the wealth and success they've manifested by just visualizing and asking the universe for it. Thing is, if that's even a little true, if there's even the slightest possibility that you bring about events or change reality just by thinking about it and basically visualizing, then it's actually a really terrifying thought. Not because it might mean success for some people who clearly don't deserve it, but because people don't just have nice thoughts. Not everyone is a happy-clappy ball of positivity. Think of all the children who visualize a monster beneath their bed. All the kids who pull the bedclothes up over their heads, afraid of the thing in the closet. There's an awful lot of kids doing a whole lot of visualization. So if manifesting is real, if it is possible to change the universe just by visualizing, then it could have some really horrible consequences. Some visualize money and fame. Kids visualize monsters. Of course, back in the day when I was just a pimply teenager with nothing better to do with my time than scare the crap out of my little brother and his mates, I wasn't thinking like that. Back then, I genuinely thought it was funny to make stuff up and see if they'd believe it. I thought it was just a joke, the sort of teasing that big brothers always do to their siblings, and something I could laugh about with my own mates later. To put it short, I was responsible for all the stuff with the end shed, but in all absolute honesty, I never knew what I was doing at the time. Even saying it now, it sounds stupid. Just the sort of throwaway thing that most kids would have forgotten about by the end of the day, but which, for whatever reason, my little brother and his mates decided to absolutely run with. We'd walk back from playing football. My mates had gotten tickets for an actual football match, and so we were away for the day. So I was stuck basically babysitting my little brother by taking him and his mates down to the fields for a kickabout. If I'm honest, it was actually a pretty good laugh, but I was still miffed at not having gotten a ticket to go with my friends to the match, and like a typical immature teenage boy, decided to take it out on my little brother. We were on our way back, taking the dirt path out from the playing fields and ironically avoiding the chicken run because I was still a little creeped out by my own childhood boogeyman, Ragbag the Scarecrow, who stood in Ackerley's field. Maybe it was the thought of all the times I had run past that creepy old scarecrow, or the fact that the sun was just setting, but for some reason my mind jumped to all those old spooky stories we'd tell as younger kids, and I decided to try one out on my little bro. Looking over the wire fence into the allotments, I pointed to a dilapidated old shed in the corner of one field. The ground in front hadn't been tended for years, and clearly the allotment wasn't actually being used anymore. So I figured that would be a good venue. The shed itself had once been green, but the paint had chipped and weathered off so that the wood, rain-beaten and of a dry, gray color like ancient bones, showed through on almost every surface. The door was padlocked with a heavy chain, both of which had turned a dull brown orange of old rust. I imagined that this must have been an allotment belonging to some old codger, who had tended to it and grown vegetables and stuff for years, but who had died without ever selling on the land. Certainly the old wheelbarrow in front, full of mud and wild grass growing in every direction, showed that the place hadn't been touched for years. It was perfect. That, I said to my brother, pointing one finger out dramatically toward the small wooden edifice, is the end shed. Make sure you never ever go near it. In fact, if you can avoid it, don't even look at it for too long. At first, my little bro Andy seemed to just shrug off the words, already immune to my winding him up, and actually went so far as to mock. Yeah, right. You're just trying to scare us, he said. Though I did notice that he clutched the football he'd been carrying just a little tighter to his chest. Scare you? I countered. I'm trying to warn you. I worry about you guys, and I don't want you getting... Oh well, never mind. Just don't go near it, okay? Don't want us getting what? Andy fired back. Though I kept a concerned look on my face as I glanced furtively back at the shed, inside I was grinning from ear to ear. I've got him, I thought. Already hooked, I've got him. I don't want you getting, eaten? What? Said Andy, trying to laugh off the suggestion and pretend that he wasn't scared in front of his mates. It might have worked too. Had one of his friends, a wet little lad named Paul, not turned white as a sheet at the suggestion. What do you mean? Asked Paul, his jaw almost on the floor. Well, don't tell anyone I told you this, bud. That's where the Gunny Man lives, I said. The boys looked at each other. They didn't recognize the name. They couldn't have because I literally made it up that moment, but they knew instinctively the type of thing, the species of the darkness that the Gunny Man was likely to be. I don't know if you've heard of him, and he's probably just a story, but my friend's friend said that his little brother got dragged away into that shed and that the Gunny Man ate him. Like something from one of those old fairy tales where the orc gobbles up the prince. The shed used to belong to an old guy called Walter, but when he died, the Gunny Man slithered out of the dark and into the shed. That's why they keep it locked, why they have that massive padlock on the door. They need to keep him in there in case he gets hungry and comes out looking for kids, especially kids called Andy. Get bent, said my brother, storming off as if he didn't believe me and trying as best he could to act macho in front of his friends. But I guess I knew. I knew that he'd taken the story on board and would be thinking about it for a long time after. It wasn't until about 5 years later, though, that I realized just how deeply. A few days before what happened, I was actually out in front of that shed with a mate of mine called Eddie. We'd been hanging out at his girlfriend's house and were making our way back around 9 p.m. It was already dark, but we decided to take the shortcut out by the playing fields and up the back road past the allotments. We were almost to the end when Eddie suddenly stopped and pointed to the end shed. That thing freaks me out, he said as he continued walking, shivering, though it wasn't cold. What do you mean? I said, thinking maybe he didn't like the allotments themselves or being on this lonely back road. That shed, the end shed. You must have heard of it. It's where the Gunny Man lives. I almost screamed hearing him say that. Are you for real? I said, laughing out loud. Where did you hear that? I literally made that up years ago to scare my brother. The bloody Gunny Man. That's brilliant. I laughed. Eddie wasn't laughing. Don't talk bull, he said sternly. My granddad told me when I was a kid, so there's no way you could have made him up. God, you think you invent everything. No, I protested. No, I definitely. But Eddie wasn't listening. He had already set off up the path and left me standing there alone. Thinking about what he said, I looked back at the shed, hunched there in the dark, and wondered. In my head, I was sure I made it up. I remembered the day, the football, the look on my brother's face. I remember thinking up the name, in that we were on that path because I hadn't wanted to walk past old Ragbag. Was it possible that the story had spread that far? That Eddie had heard it and then projected back to something his grandfather had told him? Or was it possible that the story was older? That I thought I'd invented it, but really it had been in the town for years? I glanced at the shed, at the rotted wood panels, the chain still fastened on the door, and the chipped flaking paint, and felt suddenly nauseous. Suddenly, though I was convinced that I had invented the story, I didn't want to be anywhere near the end shed, because now it was no longer just a shed for me either. Now, it was where the Gunny Man lived. A few days later, my brother was arrested. Him and his stupid mates, now teenagers, had decided between them that they were going to kill off the end shed myth once and for all. After years of whispering about it and rushing past the shed every single time they made their way home, they had decided to get rid of the shed altogether. So, without thinking, they lit a fire on the allotment just at the front door of the shed with the intention of burning it down. What they should have done, what they had planned to do, was to set the fire and then run away, leaving it to burn itself out on the allotment and reduce the shed to a pile of ash. What stopped them from doing that was the screams. Horrible wailing screams that came from inside as someone or something banged furiously against the insides of the shed, kicking and screaming to get out, thumping against the wooden panel walls in a desperate attempt to escape. Hearing this, my brother and his friends panicked and actually rushed toward the shed in a valiant attempt to rescue whoever was inside, kicking at the door, and despite the flames, trying as best as they could to break in. They were still in the act of doing this, their forearms and hands blistered and burnt when the fire brigade and police arrived on the scene, and they were arrested, but not before screaming to the firemen that there was someone inside, trapped. Their story when they got to the station was that they had just been walking home, that they had seen the fire, and upon hearing the screams, had tried as best they could to break in order to rescue whoever was inside. Technically, according to their story, they were heroes. Since the police were unable, or perhaps unwilling to, bother proving that the boys had been involved in starting the fire in the first place, they were eventually released without charge. When my brother asked about the person inside, he was warned not to say things like that in case he got charged with making a false statement or wasting police time. There had, of course, been nobody in there. The fire brigade had put out the flames after having axed the door and gone in to explore the claims of someone inside, had found nothing but the charred remnants of some gardening equipment and old clothes. Though he had not been badly burnt by his attempts to get into the shed, my brother was nevertheless deeply scarred by the whole thing. On the one occasion he did talk to me about it years later whilst drunk out of his mind, he said that to this day he would swear on a stack of Bibles that he heard someone fighting to get out from inside that shed, kicking and screaming and banging against the wall sides even as they burned. Trying to reassure him, I said that it was probably the gas, trapped in the wood being released and hissing as it escaped and the shed heated up. I also suggested it might have been an animal trapped inside, some creature that had managed to burrow inside and was desperate to get out when the flames started. Either way, it had clearly escaped because the firemen found nothing inside. I remember when I said this that Andy looked at me with such a look, a fixed stare that made him look not so much scared as hollow, that I thought I might drop my drink. He said that he'd thought of both of those theories before, but that he knew they weren't true. It wasn't gas escaping or an animal trying to get out. He knew that with dead certainty. Because when whatever was in there started screaming, he said quietly, it also called my name.